Technology everywhere, and not a drop is being used. I know that sounds like a rather strong and kind of harsh title, and kind of done so on purpose, but I kind of liken it to being in a life raft out in the middle of the Atlantic with water everywhere and not a drop to drink. You know, technology is everywhere, but it's not being used properly, as well as therefore not being aligned with business strategies. You would think in the digital age that we live in that these problems would be the exception, but not the norm that's going to be pointed out in this article. We're going to look at a few common myths that are deemed by the authors and discuss their shortcomings, followed by real-life examples and explanations. So here's the title: Why Strategy Execution Unravels and What to Do About It, by Saul, Holmes and Saul from HBR, March 2015. Little background information on how they accomplished their research. Conducted over a period of 5 years, 7,600 managers in 262 companies across 30 industries, distinct industries, rather. Companies typically had 6,000 employees on average and sales of 430 million. So what does that mean? They didn't go down to the two-man ice cream store and said, hey, I'm going to ask you some of these questions. Companies are involved in volatile sectors such as financial, IT services, oil and gas, and about a third of companies represented those involved in emerging markets. So why am I putting that in there? Well, it's important to remember that these volatile industries and emerging markets need agility, they need speed, they need decision. Therefore, you know what else they need? They need IT to give them real-time data and information so they can act upon it, differentiate themselves, get that advantage, build up your barriers to entry, and then eventually have the government force you to tear it down. But in the meantime, you can make some profits. And surveys were done, rather research were done by those in the company with critical decision capabilities. What they did, they would approach the organization, say who makes the decisions for bump, and bump. They would point them to the right person, and these are the actual people, the actual managers, the 7,600 that were doing the survey. You know, they weren't asking the parking lot attendant these questions. And they had a 95% response rate, which I thought was relatively high, with an average completion time of 40 minutes. I kind of like that 40-minute denotation there, only because to me it seems they didn't just blow through it just to get it done, which I've been guilty of from time to time. Now, any fan of statistics, which must be a minority of fan of statistics, realize that 7,600 is a pretty large sample size. And if you remember back to your stat days, a sample size of that large, you can apply the central limit theorem, which therefore means that the information found in the sample can then be applied to the population as a whole. So let's jump right in. The 5 myths of the article were: execution equals alignment, execution means sticking to the plan, communication equals understanding, a performance culture drives execution, and execution should be driven from the top. You know, wow, that sounds like a lot of practices in business school textbooks. I'm not a fan of one of those, but not textbooks rather, but one of myths that are up there, but we'll get to that in a little bit. So, you know, on paper it seems they're doing right, but they're not. But we'll jump into that in a second. We're going to be focusing on execution equals alignment. Execution is sticking to the plan, and a performance culture drives execution. The reason we're looking at these is I feel that these three have a stronger tie to technology, and they're not. And if IT is not being properly utilized or used at all, then the business strategy and the alignment is going to hurt even further. So, myth 1: execution equals alignment. The breakdown in communication is really what this comes down to. It's funny, I'm glad the authors did such in-depth research on this, because on the first note you see handoff communication and the quality information ranked really high between subordinates and their supervisors. It seems like they're humming right along. IT is being used appropriately. Information is shared quite easily up and down the hierarchy, up and down the corporate ladder. However, there's a huge difference that pops up when asked the same question between functional groups and different departments. You know, 84% of people said they could rely on information up and down between themselves and their superiors, or supervisors rather, but only 9% of responders say that they can rely on information from other functional units all the time, and only 4.5 say most of the time. So there's a huge breakdown in communication. Um, it's obvious, it's glaring right in front of you. And what's weird is, if you looked and saw how many people were surveyed and the number of companies that are being surveyed, this sticks out that it's a quite common occurrence. So why does this happen? Obviously they've got the technology and they can use it, but they're not. Well, it comes down to this. These are hierarchical silos. Up and down the ladder's fine, but going across isn't. There's obvious benefits. Before IT and before the advent of such great technology, these things failed miserably. But it's weird. We're repeating history again, and they're still failing miserably. There are benefits to the silo mentality. It allows employees to function at what they know best. I'm going to be honest with you. I've been doing neuro and psychopharmacology for almost 12 years now, and I know it like the back of my hand. I'm proud to say that I teach this to medical school students and residents. However, you ask me what the first line agent is for familial hypertension, I could tell you what it was 25 years ago, but what it is now, I don't know. However, working in my silo as well as my team, we've got a deep knowledge of the subject at hand, which is very beneficial to a psychiatric hospital. One of the listed benefits is it helps avoid redundancies, which I put that in there because I actually happen to disagree with that, and I'm going to get to that on the con side. So, on the con side, recreate information developed and maintained from other areas. Kind of sounds like a hard redundancy to me. I think Perlson and their managing and using information systems, to me that was rather redundant, having those in different, or not redundant, but just didn't make sense. Communication gaps, absolutely, and that's exactly what the previous slide is pointing out. Finger pointing, I'll tell you, right now, back in January, I took receipt of these automated dispensing machines to go into the med rooms to speed the delivery process of medication up, and a vendor supplying that. And unfortunately, we centralized all of our IT assets out of central office in Albany, and they were supposed to be installed the second week of January, and it's now July, and they're still collecting dust. Hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars of equipment just not being used. And guess what happened? Finger pointing. Central IT in Albany said, you didn't give us this. The vendor said yes, and anytime a problem kicked up, we would spend weeks and weeks just listening to people point fingers at each other, and nothing got done, which is just horrendous. But wait, I thought technology was supposed to prevent this from happening again and help guide strategy. Yeah, it should, but guess what? It only does if it's used and used properly, as we just mentioned. So how do you fix this? How can companies go back and take a look at what they're doing right, what they're doing wrong, to be more competitive, to get that differentiation, to gain that sustainable advantage? How do they do it? Well, the answer is simple. It's a capability audit, which involves four things: reviewing your process and infrastructure, your people and partners, your organization and their culture, and the leadership and governance. Now, here's the thing. I currently work for an organization where we have all these meetings, and we look at things, and we never do anything with it. All the information sits in a nice little binder. It's not shared. It's not disseminated. And I think that may be the norm for a lot of organizations out there. We do so many things to say that we did, but we don't really do anything with what we found. And to me, I think this is what one of the biggest issues is out there. I'm not really going to go into a lot, if any, on people and partners. Obviously, it's a key component. The partnership wasn't really a key thing in the article, but I'm kind of going along that this should be low-hanging fruit for an organization, that, you got to retrain and attract top talent. And we'll go deeper from there. So process and infrastructures, the end-to-end analysis from nuts to bolts, money in, money out. Is the organization's process and infrastructure efficient and effective? Basically, do people and the partners have the information needed and the infrastructure to support them to follow their goals? If you don't have that, all your corporate strategy is just a sign on the wall. It's not going to be obtained, you're not going to get anywhere, and time's going to pass you by. The end-to-end analysis will allow one's organization to provide activity and coordination in real time through IT. And you got to make sure that the IT technologies being used are compatible with each other and can communicate. I mean, look at the older days of IBM, International Business Machines. One of the cases in the text, had all these legacy systems, nothing talked to each other, losing money hand over fist. They went in, they realigned, they did outsource. Not that that's necessarily a bad thing. And then they actually made a higher profit margin on lower revenues the following year or two after they went through and realigned them. So this is a very key thing that you should be doing. Organization and culture. Does the organization promote a helpful environment? If I call up IT services, is Neil or Kathy going to yell at me because I downloaded Google Chrome again? That's kind of a funny thing to say, but if I call up HR and say, hey, I need this form, and I get screamed at, or I don't get it at all, and I get pushed around, and just waiting and waiting, that's an organization cultural thing. Are roles and responsibilities clearly delineated? Do people know what they have to do, and do they do it? And does everybody share the same goals and vision? Communication, IT, all of these things make these processes that we're discussing more streamlined and efficient. If executed properly, the organization enables information sharing. Obviously, this isn't being done, as well as monitoring alongside with real-time information and to increase agility. How can one take on new opportunities with this golden chance to differentiate if the culture is not set up to allow it? But we'll go into more on monitoring later. Leadership and governance, involving strategic and operation controls and the shared culture throughout the organization. Leadership and governance basically defines the strategic position, goals, and prioritizes projects, defines the objectives. Leaders should be communicating a clear vision. And if this isn't being done, again, this is nothing more than a poster on the wall that people don't even look at. You're not going to get anywhere. So IT is there. It's just not being used. Here it is where they're mentioning that, all these problems that are popping up, all these can be solved with IT. It's straightforward. It's there. Execution can happen and can happen properly. It can align everything up with what the vision is, what the business plan is. But people, this has to be used, and it obviously isn't. So, on to myth 2. Execution means sticking to the plan. Well, I'm going to be honest with you. When I say that out loud, it's painful to my ears. I don't know how many times I've written down plans, whether we're opening up a new unit or a new floor. I've got pharmacists assigning new roles and responsibilities, and everything that we planned, a lot of things pop up that we didn't expect, and we're kind of scrambling around trying to fix it. Brown and Hagel argued for a more disciplined use of IT. Hands down, absolutely. In the earlier days of IT, people were buying IT products or building in-house systems so they could have it, but they weren't really doing much with it. They also realized that there's a gap between the utilization of IT assets and their potential, and therein lies the gold mine of opportunity. Look at American Airlines Sabre, what that did. Look what American Health Supply Company did with their hospital. They realized that they had an IT asset. Some pretty good market managers out there realized that they could move these things to the front end of the business, and they reap the benefits. Again, It differentiated, sustained a competitive advantages, and then the government came in and broke it down. What I took out of Brown and Hagel to my own personal use. Here I am. I went out before I started this class a month or so ago, bought a really expensive desktop. I personally like desktops. And I've got Excel. I've got all my stuff in here. And looking at that last slide, that there's that gap that emerged. Yeah, there is a gap. I've got all these things that can do such wonderful technology applications, but I wasn't using them. So there's the gap, and here's the opportunity I found in that gap. I made up an Excel spreadsheet with keywords, what chapter they were related to, what page they were in the book, and what page they were in the handouts with some miscellaneous information. I came across a stumbling block on the quiz, Control F, and type in the keyword or type in what I was confused. Bingo! Chapter, book, or page outline with some miscellaneous notes, and probably the only thing that allowed me to get through that last quiz on time. But I don't think a lot of organizations are doing this. I think they just see that gap just getting farther and farther, and quite possibly just almost shunning away from the responsibility that they have to mine that gap for opportunity. So back to what we said before. Execution means sticking to the plan. Opportunity knocks, but they weren't in. How can you seize opportunity if all you're doing is just sticking to a plan? All conceivable opportunities are not present in the annual strategy planning meeting. Both big and small firms must be agile and fluid in order to capitalize on any opportunity that can impart differentiation amongst the competition. And really, this is no different than a coach on the side of a football game, just having their nose down in a playbook that they wrote and designed before the season even started. Agility and technology, when used together, will allow one to do many great things. Launch new IT-enabled products, Boeing and their Dreamliner. Decrease the time and cost of pursuing new innovations. Decrease time, you can act faster. Decrease cost, you've got more money to pursue. When opportunity does arise and knock, you can jump on it. And create barriers to entry once differentiation occurs. Again, this makes you more agile in streaming operations and reducing delays and redundancies. Will be more important once your innovation attracts other people who will start imitating. Other examples, Intuit, Quicken, product differentiation, huge. When that first came out, it took me hours to download my file or to type in my stock purchases and everything else, because I couldn't download them down through the server. Hours, literally hours. And guess what? I'm with Quicken now to the end of time, because I am not going to do that again. As Professor mentioned, Amazon's one click makes it too simple. Since organizations have spent so much on revenue on IT, they must be able to turn around on a dime, right? 5% of revenue is a huge amount of money. But no, not even close. A third of the respondents admitted difficulties in adapting to changes in their environment. Only 30% rather said that the organization fluidly shift funds to support strategy, and 20 and 22% felt they sufficiently shifted employees to support the strategy. And finally, 22%, 1 in 4 roughly, feel their organizations actually exit declining or unsuccessful initiatives. That last point streams the fact that they're not doing boundary positioning in part of their strategy. You're just throwing bad money after good. And those first 3 points really relay the fact that, IT and capability audits are not being done. And then IT is not even properly factored into strategic planning. My favorite slide. There are 2 types of people in the business today, the quick and the dead. Professor Philip Bombay from the movie Back to School in 1986, if that invokes any memories or not. Maybe not everybody in the class would get that, but some of the older folks might. When I read the chapters in the Harvard Business School article, I immediately thought of this quote from one of my favorite movies growing up. It amazes me that this quote is more accurate today than it was nearly 30 years ago, or even more so whenever it was first coined. But what's even more amazing to me is that with all the technological advantages, they're not being used. And this is all outlined in the previous slides. Let's face it, the status quo stinks. But yet the data hardly points to anything but keeping the status quo for these large majority of the companies. And again, with that many managers being sampled in school, it's not that big of a stretch to apply it to the whole population of organizations. I don't think that the problem stems from one simple thing not being done on an organizational checklist, but as the reading suggests, these end-to-end analysis just aren't being done. And when they are done, they need to be done with an entrepreneurial experience, or excuse me, spirit. From personal experience, I know that organizations that I've worked for only seem to embrace innovation from the C-suite, and that's the only place where good ideas can come. I just makes me wonder how far along today Google would be had they adopted that as part of their culture. Myth 3, our final myth: a performance culture drives execution. Yeah, that makes sense on paper, but it goes a little deeper than that, and there's two flaws with this myth. One, that there's still a large imbalance in the principal-agent relationship, and hang on tight for that one. We're going to go into a little bit deeper in that detail. And equally importantly, I felt, was that incentives are still based mostly on past performances. So the large imbalance between the principal and the agent, theory dictates that there must be some level of imbalance. But in the information age, based on this article, it seems there's too much of an imbalance that really should be. And that IT obviously is not being used to properly monitor and reward their employees. If the principal had the time to watch the agents, the agent wouldn't be needed. But if IT is being used properly, these underperformers, for lack of a better word, can be exposed, and therefore hopefully raise the morale of the entire operation, as well as profitability, alignment, and all the great things that go along with that. I'm going to talk to you about, we're going to call him James, the problem pharmacist. This is a real life example. James always complained that he was doing all the work in the department. Everyone else said that he barely worked at all. In fact, he claimed that anytime I left the room, he was surfing online for financial data for his own personal use. James complained that he never had enough time to do his job, and complained that he didn't have time to take on new projects or assignments. And James required a lot of constant reminders to complete tasks outside the pharmacy itself, which you can imagine if someone's ardently saying, I don't have time, and they're asked to do more, a lot of conflict's going to arise out of that. Truth be told, I'd probably be friends with James outside of work, but working with James is a nightmare, or was a nightmare when I got my promotion. Some disclaimers: I'm the type of supervisor that I need to see things. I don't like word of mouth before I act on something. James can obviously say that he's the kind of person that other people work harder when he's around, but not for the right reasons. I realized relatively early on that the solution to my problem lied in the use of IT, which I don't think is being done in these other organizations, which we'll go over in a minute. Once I did that and went to IT for a solution, I call it James versus hard data. I found that his log on time when starting the day and after lunch breaks were 15 to 20 minutes longer than his coworkers. That's roughly 3/4 of an hour that could have been put more towards doing the work assigned to James. Pulled his internet search activity and usage reports, could pull up to the minute where he was looking at, where and what he was looking at, how much time he spent on it, and basically it's funny when it came to that. James's internet use was 2 to 3 times that of the average pharmacist, and what he was looking at did not have anything to do with the practice of pharmacy. Finally, I pulled the workload reports that showed that James only carried 22% of the total workload out of a staff of 3 pharmacists, including himself. James knew I had him dead to rights. He did try to test me a few times, which were met with disciplinary measures, which were backed up by the hard IT data. And I can honestly say that, he's elevated his game to an area where I feel he's working at 99% of his capabilities. And it's allowed me to be more a productive manager. I'm not tracking him down or chasing him down to do this or do that. And James knows there's no BSing anymore. He can't fight the numbers. And was able to take the time I spent with dedicated to building my case for James, and able to use that to have my other two pharmacists go out and take on clinical activities, which really differentiated our department amongst others in the Office of Mental Health. And there's more information in the article itself that said, roughly 30% of managers weren't acting in a timely manner with underperformers. And personally, that's a combination of one or two things. They don't either have the IT to conduct such audits, or they're not using it. If they're not using it, that's an issue unto itself, because just like everything else we've discussed, if you're not using the IT, you're not going to benefit from it. And it really is going to boil down to you're going to accept the work output of the least common denominator. Finally, incentives based solely on past performances. Past performances are a good metric, but I personally don't feel it places enough emphasis on staff utilizing IT to the full extent. I feel more that you're just looking behind you. If I was looking at the price of Google 4 years ago, I know 4 years ago is a long time out for this example, but I wanted to overly simplify it. So what? What I feel needs to happen is that the incentive process should be based on how the employees utilize IT. As we previously discussed, opportunities pop up at any given time, and it's how our employees utilize IT to improvise, adapt, and overcome challenges unexpectedly that should be looked at on an even keel with past performance. Because this is what this is going to do. This is going to encourage innovation, and that innovation, as I said before, is the key to differentiation. And you've got the IT tools to empower it, and you can build that system in to potentially reward them monetarily. Justification, justification, justification. It seems that's what a lot of IT professionals have to do to justify their expense. And also appears that Mr. Carr has made a somewhat indelible point on those with the power of the purse strings. If incentives were based on how well employees used IT within the organization as just past performances, a wonderful opportunity arises. You can use the internal rate of return. Internal rate of return calculates the return of the IT investment, what would have been compared to corporate policy rate of return. You're going to have all these years of data to benchmark against, in all different ways the organization may have been similar or different compared to today. And it's right there. It's going to allow you to use that internal rate of return to show, yes, these IT expenditures are worth it, and they're saving us a lot of money. My last slide, Mr. Gates. Information technology and business are becoming inextricably interwoven. I don't think anyone can talk meaningfully about one without talking about the other. And Gates is right, they're interwoven. However, it's only going to be those that embrace what IT has to offer and to look at the possibility and not just its cost. They'll be the ones that will ultimately be successful. So looking back, there's a lot of myths out there that this is how we run a business, but the overall theme of this project is IT is not being utilized properly. And it's kind of scary. Again, this is a pretty large sample size. And if it's not being done in such a large sample size, again, it's not being done in the entire population. What this means is these audits need to take place. You need to analyze their capabilities. You need to do whatever you can to differentiate. Otherwise, back to Professor Philip Pombay, it's the quick and the dead. And the information's out there. You just need to do something with it. Thank you.